Cuban Missile Crisis Part 3, and again we will start with Friday, October 26th. And you saw part of this on the video. President Kennedy that morning received a telephone call from Secretary of State McNamara, who was still stationed at the Pentagon. Need one, Kendra? Still stationed at the Pentagon. And what did McNamara report to him? Right, a Soviet ship called the Grozny they had lost track of and actually ran the quarantine line. So President Kennedy received a telephone call from Secretary of State McNamara. He was still stationed at the Pentagon, and McNamara informed the President that the Navy had lost location of one of the 6 Soviet tankers, remember, that were still going for Cuba. And it was later learned that the Grozny had crossed the quarantine line that morning. Well, they find the Grozny, and after trying to signal them for over an hour, Admiral Anderson contacted the Pierce and ordered them to follow the rules of engagement for a ship running the blockade. So they find the Grozny, and at the Pentagon, Admiral Anderson contacts the USS Pierce, the captain of the Pierce, and he orders the captain of the Pierce to follow the rules of engagement for a ship running the blockade, which is what, Casey?
Fire a warning shot.
Over the bow, and if they don't stop, shoot the rudder out and board the ship. That's what he ordered the captain of the Pierce to do. Well, they followed the first part of that. Admiral Anderson ordered that shell flares be shot across the bow of the Grozny. Now, what are flares? They sound real, but it's like when you go to a track meet, they don't use a 357 or a 38 special with ammunition in it. They use blanks. And what a shell flare was a blank. The problem was, Secretary of Defense McNamara had no idea they were flares, and his immediate reaction when he heard shots fired over the intercom is that they were shooting live rounds, and he ordered General Anderson to cease fire immediately. He didn't know they were flares. So not knowing the shots fired were only flares, McNamara got very upset. He ordered the fire to cease immediately, because what had President Kennedy stated?
Do not shoot.
There will be no shooting upon Soviet ships without my explicit permission. Well, at this point, Admiral George Anderson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara get in an incredibly heated argument in front of everyone in the Pentagon. They have quite a confrontation. And Admiral Anderson gets very upset at McNamara because he believes he's interfering, and interference is going to lead to some of his men being killed. So Admiral Anderson strikes the first blow when this confrontation starts, and he jumps on McNamara, telling him that he's not thinking straightly, and his interference could get some of his men killed. McNamara then fires back, and he emphasizes to Admiral Anderson that the Soviet Union could have made the same mistake he made, thinking the USS Pierce had fired shells at them instead of flares. How would they know the difference initially? Which could have caused quite a confrontation. And he ended the conversation by saying, there will be no further shooting on any Soviet ships without my explicit permission. And I will only give that permission when ordered to do so by the President of the United States. So it's quite a confrontation after they follow the first step of that rule of engagement on a ship running the blockade. So again, McNamara ends the conversation by ordering Anderson and telling him that no further shots would be fired without his explicit permission. And he further stated to Anderson that permission would only come from him if he received authorization from President Kennedy. Well, good or bad, after the firing of the flares over the bow of that Soviet ship, they did stop and allow to be inspected. So it worked, but there did lead to a confrontation. So the Grozny stopped. It was boarded by a crew, ironically, from the USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., and it was searched for contraband. So the Pierce was not there alone. They were the major battleship, but the USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. was also in the waters, and it was a crew from that battleship that actually searched the Grozny for contraband. What they find on the ship of concern? Nothing. And so they allowed the ship to continue to Cuba. But they did search it and found no offensive weapons. Okay? So probably McNamara's summation that the ships that they thought were containing offensive weapons were already there, and the 6 that were on their way, remember he said, would sure look foolish shooting up a ship full of baby food. So nothing was found on the ship, the Grozny, and it was allowed to proceed to Cuba. Now really at this point in the crisis, both President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev are at a standstill. Okay? What's their biggest problem between the two of them? They're having a hard time communicating. Okay? They're having a very difficult time communicating with each other. Now, do you think the Soviet military is putting just as much pressure on Khrushchev as our military is putting on us to take action? Well, sure. So both of these guys, whether you agree with their philosophies or not, both of these world leaders are getting tremendous pressure for military action that both leaders know is going to result in war. And neither one really want it. So both President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev are trying to explore other options because neither wants their country to enter war with the other. And as tension mounts and the poor communication between the two men continues, this crisis takes the weirdest U-turn you can imagine. Because we're kind of at a standstill right now. We're in a big-time standstill. Well, what happens? A man by the name of John Scally, very important name, enters the Cuban Missile Crisis. John Scally, this fellow right here. He enters the Cuban Missile Crisis. Anybody want to guess what Scally might have been? What's that? Okay, maybe a translator. Good guess. He was a newspaper reporter. Not a newspaper, he was a television correspondent for ABC News. The last person they probably would think would be involved. He's a news correspondent for ABC, and he obviously has access to the White House and the president because he's the guy that interviews him all the time. Okay? So ABC News correspondent John Scally, who's a correspondent for ABC News, who has access to the White House and President Kennedy, enters the crisis. What do you think happened? Anybody want to guess? Close. No, you're okay there, pretty close. Well, earlier that day, Scally had received an interesting contact from a man he was familiar with. He was contacted by a man he was familiar with. And this man was a Russian by the name of Alexander Fomin. So John Scally had been contacted early in the day by a Russian by the name of Alexander Fomin. What do you think Fomin was doing in the United States? He's a Russian. How would he know Scally? What would he be?
Or another reporter.
He'd be another reporter who's from Russia reporting. But you know what he really was? He was a former KGB officer and a spy in the United States, posing as a journalist who was invited into the United States to cover and report back to the German media, Russian media. So, John Scally was contracted by Alexander Fomin. He actually is a Soviet KGB officer. He's considered the top spy from the Soviet Union in the United States, and the reason he contacted news correspondent Scally is because Fomin was an undercover spy posing as a journalist in Washington, D.C. Well, Fomin doesn't really know this, and Scally doesn't know this, and Fomin asked him to meet with him at a downtown restaurant close to the White House. So Scally gets this phone call from Alexander Fomin, who he assumes is a journalist from Russia, and he says, hey, how about if we meet at this restaurant close to the White House? I want to visit with you. He said, okay. So he meets with him. Well, during their meeting, Alexander Fomin asked John Scally if he would be willing to pass some information on to President Kennedy from Premier Khrushchev. So Scally's sitting in here having no idea what he's getting into here, and Alexander Fomin says, hey, you have the ear to the president, you have access to the White House, would you be willing to pass some information to President Kennedy from Premier Khrushchev? And here is the 4 things that Fomin wanted passed on to the president by Scally. Now think about this offer that Khrushchev is giving Kennedy. That's basically where we're at. First of all, the Soviet Union would agree to remove the missiles from Cuba. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. And the missiles that were, number 2, the missiles that were removed from Cuba would be returned back to the Soviet Union. They wouldn't be given to the United States. They'll take them out, number 1, and they will remove them and return them to the Soviet Union, number 2. They also agreed to dismantle the construction launching pads as well in Cuba. But they're going to want something in return from the United States. What are we going to have to give for the removal of the missiles and the removal of the construction pads? We have to first of all give that we have to let them take their missiles back to the Soviet Union, but what else are they going to want? Not yet. They're only going to want at this time the United States government's word that they will never invade Cuba. We'll take our missiles out and we'll dismantle the missile launching pads. The only thing we need from you is you got to let us take our missiles home, and you have to promise that you will never invade Cuba. That was the word that Scally was to pass on to President Kennedy. And he agreed to do that. And he arrived at the White House escorted by Secretary of State Dean Rusk. So Scally gets in touch with Secretary of State Dean Rusk. He says, hey, I got a situation here. I need to see the president. Rusk decides the best way for him to see the president, because he's a correspondent and will be viewed as a correspondent and would have to go through Kenneth O'Donnell, who's the appointments secretary. Rusk thought he should go with him. Well, he arrives with Secretary of State Dean Rusk without an appointment, and it irritates Kenneth O'Donnell because he sees Scally as what? A journalist who's pushing his way in to try to talk to the president to dig up some information on what's going on in Cuba. That would be the natural reaction. That's when Dean Rusk stepped in and said, hey, no, we got bigger things to talk about. We got to go in. Come in with us and you'll figure out where we're at on this deal. So if it's not for Dean Rusk, I'm not sure Kenneth O'Donnell lets Scally go in. So when Scally and Rusk explain the nature of his visit to the president, O'Donnell sends them both into the Oval Office to meet with President Kennedy. And what does Scally do? He fills the president in on the information that he had received from Fomin. Well, he gives him that information, and John Scally tells President Kennedy, listen, I only have 3 hours because we're supposed to meet again, and I'm supposed to give him your answer, whether you would be favorable to that deal or not. Okay? So President Kennedy told Scally he'd get back to him, quote, in a couple of hours. So in the meantime, the president's going to try to figure out what to do here. So Scally gives him that information, that the Soviets would be willing to remove their missiles in Cuba, and they would be willing to dismantle the launching pads, the construction pads, in return for them getting to keep their missiles, and a pledge by the United States government they would never invade Cuba. Now, if you're President Kennedy, Ivan, Before you give an answer, what do you want to find out? What do you want to find out? You're going to take the guy's word for it? So you'd probably try to see now, why would Khrushchev use Fomin to pass a message? The only way he would use Fomin is if he... What? Well, but this is pretty big. Why is he using Fomin? What would he have to do to use Fomin? Well, he's there, but he's just one of probably many. Why would he pick Alexander Fomin?
Because he knew the kind of number one.
He knew, well, kind of, but think about, if you're going to send some, what?
Bowman is high up in this.
Or, what is Khrushchev's relationship with Fomin? Must be pretty good and pretty trustworthy if he's going to send that guy to give that information. So what's President Kennedy looking for? What? Very good. What's the connection between these two? If we can find a solid connection between these two, then maybe it's a legitimate offer. Otherwise, who knows if it isn't the military trying to stonewall or get us into some, you just can't trust anybody at this point. So he's got to find a connection between Fomin and Khrushchev. So what he does during this period of time is he sends Kenneth O'Donnell to the FBI building to dig up information on Fomin, who they have a file on, to try to figure out what his tie is with Khrushchev and if it's a legitimate arrangement. Okay? So O'Donnell goes down and he reads all the way through Fomin's file and he can't find anything that would tie Khrushchev and him together. Can't find a thing. What would be your next step, Ward? If you can't find anything in Fomin's file to connect him to Khrushchev, you look through Khrushchev's file to see if there's anything that connects him to Fomin. So Khrushchev's file is quite a bit larger in the FBI. And they dig through that, and they dig through that, and they dig through that, and finally O'Donnell finds the connection he needs. The two served together side by side in World War II. They were war buddies. They knew each other well. So O'Donnell finally finds the connection he needs. The two Soviets served together in World War II. They were war buddies. And O'Donnell leaves the FBI building back to the White House to pass that word on to President Kennedy. Well, O'Donnell tells the President about it, and the President asks O'Donnell his opinion on the relationship between the two. What do you think, Kenny? You were down there. What do you think? What's your take on this? What's your take on this? And O'Donnell responded by saying, quote, "My gut's telling me that Khrushchev is turning to an old friend to carry his message." Because he doesn't want to involve anybody else. Because he can't trust anybody else either. Who does President Kennedy really trust thus far in this thing? O'Donnell and his brother. Really doesn't, has he ever gave any big time information in front of anybody else? Khrushchev's in the same boat. And he's turning to an old friend to help him communicate, Alexander Fomin. Well, Kennedy agrees, and he informs Scally that the United States would be favorable to Khrushchev's request, but we had one thing we wanted to add. What might we want to add when they remove their missiles? Are we going to trust them that they would remove their own missiles? What Kennedy wanted is those missiles removed under United Nations inspection. In other words, they would have a non-biased members from the United Nations there to supervise or at least watch these missiles being removed so they knew that it was done right. So Kennedy agreed and informed Scally that he would be favorable to Khrushchev's request. However, he wanted the missiles in Cuba removed under UN inspection. Okay? So Scally relays this information to Fomin, who in turn got the message back to Khrushchev. Khrushchev receives the news back from Fomin, and he sends a letter to President Kennedy stating the following. We might have a solution to this, right? Khrushchev gets his response from Foman back from President Kennedy, and he sends a letter to President Kennedy. This is all the same day, kids, we're talking about here. And this letter states basically two things. The first thing Khrushchev says in his letter is he is afraid of a nuclear war, just like Kennedy is. So he expresses his fear of a nuclear war. That's the first thing that Khrushchev puts in his letter. He has a fear of nuclear war, just like Kennedy did. And he puts in writing his offer of removing the missiles and missile pads in Cuba, and he agrees to the UN inspection if the United States would not only promise never to invade Cuba, but what else does he want lifted? No, not yet. What else are we doing to Cuba? The quarantine. So in the letter, Khrushchev states, I am willing, in writing, to remove the missiles and missile launching pads in Cuba in exchange for the United States lifting their quarantine line and promising never to invade the country of Cuba in the future. We are about to the end of this crisis, you would think. However, 12 hours later, the president will get another correspondence from Khrushchev that's going to be much different. What's he going to ask for in the next correspondence? The missiles in Turkey. Now there's a story behind that. It's not that simple. But the president's going to get a correspondence from Khrushchev 12 hours after this first one, and it's going to be much different. It's going to include the missiles in Turkey. Now we're not going to be... Does anybody want to give up the missiles in Turkey, really? Does the military want to give them up? No. Okay, then that